Welcome to One Bite is Everything, the podcast that connects every bite you take to the bigger world. Today's episode is one of those conversations that changes how you see something you thought you already understood. At least it did for me. Because farmers markets feel simple. You go, you shop, you support a local farmer. Done. But what if I told you that behind every stand is an entire system most of us never think about? Rules that change from state to state, decisions about who gets to sell and who doesn't, and a reality where the same tomato can mean a completely different outcome for a farmer, depending on where you buy it. And then there's this. When you buy directly from a farmer, they might keep close to 100% of that dollar. Buy that same local item somewhere else, and they could be getting just a fraction of it. That gap, that disconnect, is what we're digging into today. I'm joined by Catt Fields White of Farmers Market Pros, someone who has spent decades inside this world. She manages markets, advises market managers across the country, and sees the full landscape from the hyper-local details all the way to the national and even global forces shaping how farmers sell their food. In this conversation, we talk about how farmers markets actually work, why the rules are so different depending on where you are, the tension between purity and practicality in what gets sold, and why something as simple as where you buy your produce has a much bigger impact than most people realize. If you've ever walked through a farmer's market and thought you understood it, this episode is going to expand that view in a big way.
What even my foodie friends don't understand, and I'm a real gem to have at a dinner party when somebody puts out that mozzarella and tomato and basil, and I say, where'd you get those tomatoes? Or where'd that basil come from? Because even they don't realize that if you're buying local produce, but you're buying it from a retail store that handles local produce, or you're buying it from, we have in San Diego a big produce distributor that also has a retail section in their warehouse, so you can go in and buy it. And most of their things do come from local farmers, local meaning, a couple 100 miles. It's a big state. They also have some imported stuff. But still, buying it from them means that the farmer gets about 40 cents on the dollar of what you're paying. If you're buying it from a big box grocery store, that farmer's getting maybe 8 cents on the dollar of what you're buying. If you buy the exact same item at the farmer's market, they're keeping 100%. Or with some markets, they may be charging a percentage of maybe 10 or 12% for the space rent. So you're making this huge, huge impact on the farmers when you're buying directly from them. That is not happening even if you're buying the same local produce in a grocery store or at Whole Foods, where they do a lovely display on their end cap that says local produce from Farmer Joe, with the implication that everything in that department is from Farmer Joe or some other local farmer, when it most certainly is not. So there's a lot of greenwashing going on, especially with certain big box stores. None of those folks are paying farmers anywhere near 100%. Again, it's usually like 8 to 12 cents on the dollar. So you really make a huge difference by shopping at the farmer's market. And then the other thing is it tastes better. So even that same local produce, when it's in a big box store, they're buying the items that ship well and store well, with the idea that they can box them and they can stack them in the cooler and they can keep them for a week or two. So you don't know how fresh it is. Typically, the produce that you're getting at the farmer's market is really just picked. It's harvested in the few days before you get it. And I think we need to remember that too, just in terms of when you're marketing. Your customer wants to know what's in it for me, the old WIFM question. We had Mike Lee of the Future Market speak at our conference recently on the idea that we really need to get better at promoting our markets with the customer's main interest, which is the difference in taste when you buy things at a farmer's market versus buying produce that has been stored. It's also got great nutritional density. You're helping farmers keep farming, and all that's great. But the fact that it tastes better is what will keep them coming back. And he put it so brilliantly. We were kind of collecting the catchiest one-liners that came from the conference. And he said, so even in this room full of farmers market managers, people that are really invested in the food system, if you've gone out for just the most incredible meal, you've seen all this amazing food, you're working with a chef that gets it directly from the farmers, do you sit back and say, oh man, that was sustainable? No, you don't. You say, wow, I will remember that taste forever. That's the best thing I ever tasted. So we need to remember that the biodiversity that you can get at the farmer's market, because we don't have to worry about things being durable enough to ship or store. So varieties of tomatoes and apricots and things that would have disappeared and eating to extinction, as the book says, are still at the farmer's market. You can still find them, and they taste different. The taste is really good, and we need to remind people of that. And they can do all the other warm, fuzzy things at the same time. They can ensure biodiversity remains strong. They can make sure that farmers can keep farming because the financial benefit is so good. But first and foremost, we need to drag them in by reminding them that things taste better here. And so that's really important.
Maybe we're thinking about taste and cost and all of those things first. But when you realize that the 100% of the dollar that goes to that farmer is healing your land and keeping your environment healthy and fueling your local economy, all of these things we care about on a bigger stage, when we connect all those dots, all these little light bulbs start going off. And if we can connect that back to how delicious the basil is,
it's really important. So we have to keep telling people this, because very well-meaning people assume that if you buy something that's been locally produced at this big box store, you've done your duty, you've helped that farmer, and you have to an extent. But if you buy it direct, it's so much more beneficial to them. And nobody knows that. Most folks don't realize that because they don't know how farmers markets work.
what stands out here is how disconnected the impact of a choice feels from the choice itself. People naturally prioritize taste, cost, convenience. That's just how we're wired. But those small, everyday decisions are quietly shaping entire systems. When a farmer keeps close to 100% of what you spend, it directly affects whether they can keep farming, whether land gets preserved or sold, whether local economies stay alive or hollow out over time. The tricky part is that most people already care about those bigger things. They just experience them as abstract values, not something tied to what they're buying on a Tuesday afternoon. So the solution isn't more information or trying to convince people to care harder. It's shortening the distance between the choice and the impact, making that connection tangible. That can look like direct access, farmers markets, CSAs, even just clearer visibility into where money is actually going. But it also means leading with what people already respond to: taste, freshness, experience. Because once someone feels the difference, the rest starts to land without forcing it. It becomes less about doing the right thing and more about not wanting to go back. And from there, the awareness sticks, not as a concept, but as something lived and repeated.
We want to print on a t-shirt one of these days, what do you do the other 6 days? Because first of all, they don't even realize markets are managed. They have this idea in their heads that farmers and vendors just show up and pop up their tent. Oh, it's so cool that all these folks came out. Well, they probably didn't just come out. Somebody approved an application to keep the market in balance, and somebody made sure they had the proper permits, because every state and every county and every city has a different set of permits that people have to get, whether they're selling agricultural products or bread that they baked. Somebody had to check on that. Someone had to make sure they had insurance, because wherever those tents are setting up, there's a property owner or a city that wants to be covered. So you have to make sure everybody has insurance. The market itself has to have insurance. You've got to make sure there's tent weights on every single tent, because at some point there's going to be a bluster of wind. And if that tent flies over and hits somebody, the whole market is not in good shape, and very much so the farmer or the vendor that owns that tent. So there's a million things that you're addressing as a farmer's market manager, but people, again, even the foodiest people who love farmers markets don't seem to understand that they're managed. And then when they do understand that there's a manager, then the question comes up, what do you do the other 6 days? And it's like, oh, well, today I'm managing traffic. I'm making sure that cars stay out of the site, and I'm checking on permits, and I'm making sure tent weights are in place, and I'm answering questions. And oftentimes at farmers markets, we're processing EBT or some other forms of nutrition incentives. The other 6 days, or hopefully for managers, the other 4 to 5 days, we're doing things like renewing our permits, checking everybody else's permits to see when they expire, notifying vendors and farmers that they have to update a certificate or a permit or something that allows them to sell. We're negotiating to see if we can get the cars towed out of the site more cheaply. We're dealing with municipal regulations and trying to influence them and help cities and counties to make things more easy and obtainable for farmers at a price that they can deal with. So there's a lot to farmers market management. It really is a professional calling. And yet, I go on forums sometimes where it's a lot of farmers, and many of them realize that, and they talk about the importance of a good farmers market manager. And others say, why would somebody get paid for this? Shouldn't they just be supporting us? But just like farmers shouldn't be counted on to be the philanthropists that donate food, market managers should not be counted on to work a real live 40-hour-a-week job, which is what it takes to run a big market, for no money, even though there are still a lot of people doing it as a volunteer position. And part of farmers market management is you're dealing with a lot of humans, and these are mostly humans that own their own businesses. They are very passionate about what they're doing. They're small businesses that are supporting families. And so they take things very seriously. It's generally not a big scaled business. It's usually a family business or a business that has a couple of owners and maybe 3 or 4 employees. So you have to be very delicate sometimes in what you're doing that you know is going to benefit them and the market as a whole. But you have to take their feelings and their fears into account because you're very much dealing one-on-one with human beings there.
Let's go to a 35,000-foot view of farmers markets across the country, because that's what I want to understand is like, how many do we have? And I want to talk about the sort of spectrum of the different kinds of markets, because not all markets have the same rules.
Oh, definitely. Partly because not all market managers have the same view of what they're trying to accomplish with the market, and partly because in almost every state, farmers markets and farmers and bread bakers and sauce makers are very highly regulated. And all of those regulations are different. It's state by state and oftentimes county by county. So California, for instance, the California Department of Food and Agriculture has a set of laws that apply to farmers markets, and they're one of the most stringent in the country. New York also has some very stringent rules. But in California, part of that legislative language says that counties have the ability and the responsibility to interpret and enforce. And so the way those same rules are enforced in Napa Valley and how they're enforced in Chula Vista in the southern part of the state are completely different. So different interpretations by different county commissioners and different interpretations by individual inspectors.
So give me an example of something that's interpreted differently.
Well, in Northern California, you will find a lot of wonderful craft cheesemakers because you can make cheese in California legally. But in San Diego County, you have a whole different set of rules about how you can make cheese for sale. And it involves ultra pasteurization and a lot of rules that inhibit cheesemakers from being able to do that. We've got a minimal number of dairies in San Diego. So there is no San Diego made cheese for sale, even though there are tons of cheesemakers in Northern California. They're doing beautiful cheeses. A lot of big cheese companies started at farmers markets in Northern California. Yeah, so that's one difference. Cottage food laws very much interpreted differently from one end of the state to the other. And that's one that goes across the country and is very, very different from one state and one county to the next. So cottage food lets you make food in your home kitchen for years and years and years. If you saw a sign at the farmer's market that said homemade, that was a figure of speech because you couldn't make things in your home and sell them to the public. You had to be in a commercial kitchen that you rented from somebody or owned your own, but very few farmers market vendors have their own kitchen. Those had to be permitted and inspected by the health department, and then you could sell them to the public. Well, citizens' referendums actually in most of these states introduced new laws that legislators voted on to let you make typically non-potentially hazardous foods in your home kitchen and sell them at the market. Jelly is usually acceptable. Apple pie is usually acceptable. Cream pie is not. So it's typically nothing that requires refrigeration and nothing that's too acidic. So jelly, yes. Pickles, typically not, because you can cause botulism with pickles if you're not doing them correctly. And since the health department doesn't inspect these home kitchens, the rules are very different. Well, this has morphed into laws in some states that are very, very liberal and loose, and you can cook almost anything in your home and sell it. And then in other states, they're very tight, and you can only do certain things. And each county is giving you a list of acceptable things. And if you compare notes on these forums, this county will let you sell this and that county won't let you sell exactly the same thing. And you have to figure out your own set of rules. And then those tend to morph. These are interpretations that tend to evolve over time, so they change. Farmers in some states have more of a carte blanche. They can make a lot of things on their farm and sell them. In other states, not so much. I can go to a farmer's market almost anywhere in the US during peach season and see that peach farmers have peach pies on their tables. In California, you cannot have peach pie made by a farmer unless they get a commercial kitchen and they operate in the non-certified section of the market. Because in the certified section, you can only sell items of your own production, and most of those peach farmers aren't growing wheat, so they cannot create a pie that has a pie crust. So the level of regulation, we always laugh that I think we're subject to 8 different regulatory agencies at our markets in Southern California. We laugh that we could run a nuclear plant with far less regulatory oversight than we can run a weekly farmers market, which food safety is a thing, and that's good. But it's daunting for the farmers and for the vendors and for the market managers. And those are things that differ all over the country.
What's interesting isn't just that the rules are different everywhere. It's what that does to the system over time. When something as simple as a pie or a piece of cheese depends on which side of a county line you're on, you're not just regulating safety, you're quietly shaping what kinds of businesses get to exist at all. The farmers who make it through aren't always the best producers. They're the ones who can navigate complexity, absorb risk, or afford to play by inconsistent rules. And everyone else just disappears before you ever knew they were an option. So what we end up calling local food isn't actually a pure reflection of local land or talent. It's filtered through policy, interpretation, and friction. The loss here is often invisible. It's the products that never get made, the small producers who never scale, the diversity that never reaches the table. And that's the real tension. We want safety and structure, but we rarely question how much creativity and accessibility gets squeezed out in the process. The solution isn't just simplifying regulations. It's recognizing that every barrier doesn't just protect the system, it also edits it.
Now, I have been in conversations with other people in the farmers market sector that have talked about, should we lobby for a set of federal regulations so that at least the rules would be the same from one part of the country to the other? And the trick with that, as somebody always points out, is do we want to lobby and end up with California rules, which nobody wants to comply with? Or do we want to lobby and end up with Texas rules, which everybody worries about because there's virtually no regulation on food sales there? I know there are some regulations in Texas, but they're much, much looser. And so nobody wants to have the loosest rules and nobody wants to have the tightest rules. And if you take it to the feds, who knows what they'll come up with? So we haven't much lobbied for consistent rules for the whole country.
I love this perspective that you have over what's going on in farmers markets across the country. How many are we talking about?
Right now in the US, there's about 8,700 farmers markets that are about half of those, I would say, in the past have been seasonal. More and more farmers markets are pushing to be all year round, which means in certain climates that you're going to see a lot of root vegetables, but also a lot of preserved things, pickles and jams and sauces and all the things that you can make out of that produce that are going to be heavier on those tables in the, say, the very deep winter time. Or in Texas or Florida, you're going to see preserved foods in the hot seasons of the year and then fresh food in the winter. So a lot of them are stretching to full year, which I personally think is a really good trend. And it's helped by things like hoop houses and different growing methods that have helped farmers stretch their seasons some. Because starting a market every year after a break means, that whole thing, trying to get customers back into the habit and doing extra marketing to let people know when you're open and when you're not. And if we want people to have a shopping habit where they get the bulk of their groceries from farmers markets, they need to be there all year so that they can keep that habit. We will always talk to our farmers and vendors. We're rain or shine markets, and I think the majority of markets are. And farmers really like it. They do not want a market to be called because of rain, because once those crops have come out in the ground, they can't put them back and they're not going to be good next week. So they're usually happy about it. Same with the bakers. Once the stuff comes out of the oven, if you call a market for rain, they're stuck. What are they going to do with that? But a lot of other kind of peripheral vendors, people that sell things in jars, that kind of thing, will maybe complain about coming out in the rain. And we always explain to them, if we close, if we don't build the trust with our customers that we are for sure going to be there every Thursday from 3 to 7, then what they're going to do when it rains is they're going to go to Trader Joe's or they're going to go to their local grocery store, and they may find out that parking is easier and that there's only one cashier to deal with and it's a little bit simpler, and they'll miss the community aspect, but they'll also have to weigh the fact that I can get peppers here. They're wrapped in plastic, they're on a styrofoam tray, but I can get them here. And so we don't really want to tell them that. We want to make them remember that the only place to get fresh produce is at the farmer's market and that they want to make that their weekly grocery habit.
Tell me about these rules. We were talking a little bit about resellers and farmers, and just explaining what that is and what the pros and cons of that kind of.
In some states, California included, and I'm not sure about New York, although I know that most large farmers market organizations in New York have rules about this. And there's other states where there may be rules about not allowing resellers in a market. In California, you cannot legally have a reseller on the property, even in the non-certified section, if you're a certified farmers market. You can only have producers. So each of the farmers needs to be inspected by the county and show that they're actually growing everything that they're bringing to the market on the table. They're not even allowed to do what they call supplementing, which is you're growing grapefruit, but you don't have that many trees. You got a lot of customers at your market. Can you pick up grapefruit from the farm next door and sell them? Nope. You have to be selling what's of your own production. And then there's a lot of farmers markets where there are not county or state laws that require you to not have resellers, but their policy, and this is very, very common at most markets, that they're a producer only market. So which means you only have farmers selling farm produce. You don't have a farmer across the aisle from somebody that's just going to a warehouse, picking up produce that comes from who knows where and piling it on the table. And there are good things about that and bad things, and it's managed to a different level at various farmers markets across the country if there are no legal restrictions as there are in some states. Some farmers markets are so strict on producer only that, for instance, you cannot sell bread unless it contains locally grown wheat. Well, it would be impractical for us to do that because we don't really grow grain to any great degree in California. So one thing we don't grow. But in the Midwest, you can certainly do that. The Minneapolis farmers markets, many of them, Mill City Market up there, has a really strong program of checking to make sure that the people who are not farmers but are bringing other products are using local ingredients in that product. And I would say that probably the majority of farmers market managers try to have some level of requirements that fall under that. Even if you've got somebody selling a stir fry in a prepared food booth, you want to make sure they're getting their vegetables directly from the farmers, because that's our prime purpose, is to support farmers. So having resellers at a market is a little bit tricky because you can buy fruits and vegetables that are grown in Mexico or in South America, or shipped from Canada or the Ukraine. I think I was seeing cucumbers from the other day. And those oftentimes are cheaper to buy wholesale by far than the cost of actually producing them here. Land is cheaper in those countries. There are not necessarily the same regulations. There are certainly not the same wage rates for people that are helping you on your farm. So they can oftentimes undercut the prices of people who are actually growing the produce. So that irritates farmers, and you'll find that there's a reasonable number of farmers that won't participate in a market that allows resellers. On the other hand, I have been in farm forums where growers have said, and not all growers certainly in any of those forums, but there will be lively discussion because some of the farmers will say, hey, you know what? And it's for the same reason we stay open, rain or shine. They'll say, you know what? If you can't get bananas here and you're going to have to give your kids bananas, you're going to go somewhere else to get them. And when you go somewhere else to get bananas, you're going to pick up squash and you're going to pick up tomatoes, because who has time to make many, many stops to get their grocery order done? So some farmers are in favor of having a mix of resellers and producers. And I would say the places that works the best are the ones where they do allow resellers, generally if that is not a product that is grown locally and then no farmers are available to sell it. So they're picky about what they let resellers bring in. And the other element that is super important, and they had a big fight about this up at the Montreal markets in Canada, and what they resolved was they needed very, very clear signage, direction, informational brochures that made it very, very clear which of the sellers were producers and which of the sellers were resellers so that the customer could make an informed decision about what they wanted to do. Maybe they're okay with buying imported lemons, but they definitely want to get anything they can get from a farmer in Lawrence, Kansas. So that I've seen as a pretty good solution in some areas to covering that. Again, in some states you can't do it. We don't even have the choice where I manage markets of being able to do that. On the San Diego side, I bounce between San Diego and Philly. In Philly, you can't. You can't have resellers. And the other thing that we've seen in Philly a lot lately, and I think this happens in Ohio too, and some other places where there's a lot of plain people, where there's Amish and Mennonites, those farmers have a trick with bringing their produce into the city because many of them don't drive. And so they end up paying somebody to bring them and their produce into the city, and that makes it cost prohibitive for them to come to markets. So, what has become somewhat common in Philadelphia and the surrounding areas is seeing aggregators, and you have to figure out who you're dealing with. So, you make sure you're dealing with somebody with integrity that's doing what you want in terms of representing producers, but aggregators that will go to 4 or 5 different local farms, pick up the produce, bring it to the market. It's all sold in one stand. Hopefully, in my opinion, there's clear identification so you can tell which farm, which product comes from. Again, we want our consumers to be as informed as possible, but they're not making each farmer come to the market. So you lose that face to face with the person who grew your produce, but it can also bring a wider variety of produce to market. And for the farmers, it can be financially maybe not as good as 100%, but when some of those farmers are having to pay for transportation into the city, they definitely make more with that kind of system than they would if they had to come into the market themselves. So many variations on a theme.
Another way to look at this is through incentives. The rules around resellers aren't just about ethics, they're shaping what kind of behavior the market rewards. A strict producer only model rewards growing, but it can unintentionally penalize scale, collaboration, or even survival in tougher regions. Meanwhile, allowing resellers introduces competition that isn't on equal footing. Suddenly, farmers aren't just competing on quality, they're competing against cheaper global supply chains. So the question becomes, what are we actually optimizing for? Because every version of this system creates a different outcome. If you optimize for purity, you get integrity but less flexibility. If you optimize for convenience, you get access but risk dilution. Somewhere in between, you get these hybrid models, aggregators, selective reselling, that try to balance both. What's interesting is that none of these are neutral choices. They're actively deciding which farmers stay viable, which products show up, and what kind of food culture gets sustained over time. I feel like you're the perfect person to ask about sort of the history of farmers markets across the country because obviously farmers markets haven't been here forever.
They have not, and in fact, they used to be illegal. So it used to be just as if you're selling liquor, you have to sell to a broker who sells to a distributor who sells to the retailer. So there's a tiered system when you're selling liquor usually. Actually, we see a lot of liquor at farmers markets in Pennsylvania and in New York, not as much in some other states. So way back, and I want to say at this point, I've been teaching this section in a vendor 101 class for a lot of years. And I used to say, so 20 years ago, but I think at this point it's 40 years ago. In California, there was a packing house strike. So the folks that worked for the packing houses couldn't buy anything because the staff was on strike. They couldn't get them in boxes, they couldn't get them shipped. And so peach farmers had peaches falling on the ground and rotting because there was nowhere to sell them. They weren't allowed to sell them to the public. So there was an emergency set of laws that were passed, our direct marketing laws that still exist today. Jerry Brown signed them, I think the first time he was governor, which allowed farmers to sell directly to the public. And they had not been able to do that before that. And so once those laws opened up that opportunity, it meant that they didn't have to sell only in standard pack, which they had to before. They had to sell things that were of the same size. They had to sell X amount of units per box. It was a standard pack situation so that the packing houses could function. Now they could sell a peach to a consumer, or they could sell a bag of oranges, or they could sell one carrot or they could sell 6 bunches of carrots instead of having to sell a box. And so organized farmers markets in the US were revived then. There are some much older farmers markets in the US than that. I want to say Madison, Wisconsin may be one of the oldest. There's a really old one in New York. Lancaster, Pennsylvania has a very old market that at this point has sort of evolved into more of a food hall with some farmers in there, but it has been in operation, I want to say, for almost 200 years. But the wide proliferation of farmers markets happened then, about 40 years ago. Alice Waters and some other strong food system people helped to get the word out and to make it attractive and the thing to do. The cool kids went to the farmers market, and those grew and grew and grew. And then as more farmers understood what the financial advantage could be, and as more people got into farmers market organization and putting them together, you saw them grow more and more and more. But it isn't something that was just accepted as a right until, less than 50 years ago here in general.
Right. I mean, all the rules and the existence of farmers markets, there's a lot of stuff that I think we can take for granted. They're sort of part of society, so we're not really thinking about the last 40 years.
Now, farmers markets, though, as a whole, people showing up with their own produce to sell, whether they're sitting on blankets in Africa, whether they're in boats in Thailand with produce on the boats, certainly community markets and farmers markets have been around for thousands of years in different forms. In Italy, at some point, the produce was taken over by brokers and distributors, and they had a system that wouldn't let farmers sell. And it's been, I want to say 20-ish years, maybe a little bit less. And the organization, World Farmers Market Association, is fairly young. It's about 5 years old at this point. But they grew out of an effort in Italy to Campagna Amica, which has put together farmers markets that support farmers in selling directly to the public, took the brokers and distributors out of the middle, established some fair pricing rules so that they couldn't be undercut, and some fair pricing rules that some of us here would find restrictive. But it's helped those farmers develop a coalition and a strength to push back against the distributor-controlled system that was in place before. So there's been markets for thousands of years, but the organization of the markets and the rights of the farmers to absolutely be the ones that choose whether or not to sell to the public have definitely strengthened in the last few decades.
I was just in Rome, so I was at Campagna Amica and heard from their leaders about the market. Really eye-opening that 25 years ago, their farmers could not sell directly to the public, right? Like it's just, again, we take this structure of it for granted. And like you said, for thousands of years, people have been selling their products informally. And then at some point, there was some formalization that prevented it. And then now we've got these interesting markets. I want to hear a little bit more about Farmers Market Pros and like specifically what that organization is, but I was very impressed to hear that you're also involved on the global stage.
I mean, what happens anywhere affects us, as we can see in many of our political happenings right now in the world. The world has gotten smaller with globalization, and a lot of produce is shipped. So what's happening in fruits and vegetables globally affects farmers that are selling them here, just in terms of pricing and competition and that kind of thing. If you're competing with somebody from a long, long distance, they're paying for fuel costs and now tariffs, but they're also possibly working with a lower wage base and things. So all of that affects our local farmers as well. So yes, I've been happy to stay involved with the national organizations and also the international organizations that are supporting farmers and supporting farmers markets. I've been a farmers market manager for just under 20 years now. But as our markets continued to grow, I found, for instance, that farmers and vendors were not being taught how to sell, how to operate in a business-like manner. They would come in with these passions for whatever they were growing or producing or making, but they didn't come from a business background. And so they didn't understand how marketing works and how you want to examine your cost before you set your prices and look at the market as a whole. So we started teaching a class years and years ago in my organization called Vendor 101. It's still out there. We actually moved it online, which we should have done years before that, but we moved it online during peak COVID because we couldn't put people in a room anymore. We used to do it in person in classrooms. And so Vendor 101 is really designed for people who are thinking about coming into farmers markets, whether they're farmers or vendors, and it helps them evaluate if that's the life they want to lead, helps them understand that this is a real business. It's not just, your aunt loves your brownies and she thinks you should sell them, but doesn't understand that you have to have a commercial kitchen and that you have to look at packaging and that you have to physically come to the market on a regular basis, not just pop up when you felt like a fun weekend. So that's helped vendors. And then as we continued to do that, our established vendors said, what are you going to do to help us? And so we started additional webinars, and then market managers started asking us for tips, and we started trading information. And so we developed a conference that's an annual conference, mostly for farmers market managers. And we just had our 10th conference a couple of months ago. So we do that. We've moved our newsletter from MailChimp over to Substack so that we can do kind of some conversation there. Possibly someday lose our big Facebook group because Meta is not my hero. And so we would love to move that somewhere else. Well, Substack is a start. We'll see where it ultimately ends up. But we've got about 1,200 market managers in there that throw up questions and everybody else jumps in and tells them how they do it or makes suggestions. So it's bringing together market managers from all over the country and helping farmers and vendors. We do a lot of train the trainer kind of things where we'll say, this is what we're teaching our vendors this month. You might want to adapt this to your local rules and do the same thing so that we can help those farmers and vendors. We used to say passion meets profit was our tagline. And it's telling them that they can do what they love to do, but if they're smart about it, they can also make a living and support their families with it. And we're real determined to have that happen. There's a lot of small farm conferences on a regional basis that will teach farmers how to put in a new irrigation system or how to convert from conventional to organic or where to find seeds for certain things. But none of those conferences seem to be addressing telling the farmers how to sell and how to make sure that their business was profitable. And that's really what Farmers Market Pros grew out of. Same for market managers. There is still a big community of managers and farmers markets that are operated by volunteers or by the intern in a Parks and Rec department. If the city owns the market and they want somebody to run it, without understanding that there is so much regulation involved and that doing it certain ways can make sure that your farmers and vendors are profitable, and just outlining a map and letting people set up tents does not necessarily ensure that. So when we say farmers market pros, we're trying to remind people that this is a professional business and that done right, it can really affect the local food system and whether or not farmers remain profitable and financially sustainable.
So you have two jobs?
Yeah, so I have two jobs. My big flagship market, I sold to my daughter a couple of years ago because it's a beast. So there's two markets a week. That market is the largest market in San Diego County on Saturday. It's 6 city blocks of farmers and vendors. Handed that off to her. I had gotten more and more involved with the side where we do education and I speak at conferences and we do our own conference and I'm writing a lot. So she took over those two, but I have another market that I still manage, and oftentimes I manage it remote. I've got a terrific on-site manager that faithfully shows up there at 7 every morning, and then a couple of folks that come in to help her. But I still take every application. I still explore products and balance the market to make sure it's got the right mix, and I still do the map. So that market is just coming up on its 4th birthday, and I would say it's probably got another year or two before I truly hand it off to somebody else and feel good about it. So I'm still managing a market every Sunday. But my main job at this point is really working on the education side and spreading the word and doing the conference and supporting market managers. And that has been fun for me.
So important for people to have support and not to reinvent the wheel just because they stepped into it newly.
Which I did. I came from a publishing and marketing and restaurant background. So I had a good sense of food regulations. I knew farmers because I had a magazine that I published for independent restaurants. So I knew suppliers and things. So from that side, I had some basic knowledge, and I was a hardcore marketing person and entrepreneur. So I got that, but I did not know all the rules about farmers markets and all the things that you had to think about, and really did reinvent the wheel. And it was a wheel that was functioning perfectly well in other places, but I didn't know who to ask. And so that's kind of why we started our organization, was to have a central kind of hub of knowledge that people could share their own knowledge and compare it with other people's. And actually, when I started them, that was back in 2008. At that time, and still to some extent in many places, farmers markets looked upon each other as competition. Just like one grocery store manager probably couldn't call a manager of some other chain and ask them for advice because they consider each other competitors. And so trying to get information from the markets that were already established in San Diego County was tough. They didn't want to share who their best vendors were or what was the best map layout or whatever. So I kind of had to figure it out. But part of our mission these last years at Farmers Market Pros has been to remind people who are managing farmers markets or operating in farmers markets that we are not competitors. We as a group compete against big box grocery stores and commodity producers. We are not competing with each other. The one place where we do compete is for farmers, honestly, because shoppers would support a farmer's market on every corner. We could be Starbucks, but what's limiting is the number of farmers. And so there is some feeling of competition. I'm not going to tell you about this new vendor because I don't want you to, quote unquote, steal them from my market and take them to your market. But even that, we're seeing a lot of market managers that are coming together regionally and very hyper locally now and forming groups and keeping in touch with each other and helping each other, say, push back against a new towing regulation with the city or share vendor names. I've got these vendors. I don't have room for somebody in that category. Do you have space at your market? And it just has made the whole sector so much stronger. So we really encourage that there's a network of state and national association leaders, farmers market associations that Farmers Market Coalition put together. I facilitate a monthly call for them and they share ideas because we are not each other's enemy. And that's a strong word. I don't know if Kroger is our enemy either, but they're certainly not our friends. And we really need to be working together to promote the health of farmers markets as a group and to make state and federal regulations be helpful and be supportive as opposed to being punitive.
What's interesting here is how much of this system exists because it had to be rebuilt. We tend to think of farmers selling directly as the natural way things work. But that hasn't always been the case. There were entire systems where farmers were pushed out and couldn't sell to the public at all. So what we're seeing now isn't just tradition continuing. It's a kind of correction, a reclaiming of access, pricing power, and autonomy. But that also explains why there's so much structure, education, and coordination behind it now. Once you remove the middle layer, you don't just free the farmer. You also hand them everything that layer used to handle: pricing, marketing, logistics, strategy. And not everyone is prepared for that. So these organizations, trainings, and networks aren't just support systems. They're filling a gap that didn't exist when intermediaries controlled the system. The deeper tension is that independence sounds ideal, but it comes with complexity most people don't see. So the real shift isn't just farmers selling directly. It's farmers becoming full operators in a system that used to exclude them. And whether that model actually works long-term depends on whether they're supported in all parts of the business, not just the growing. Let's talk about regional food, like a regional food system. I'd love to hear your perspective, like the farmers markets and that system that is sort of an informal system, like the importance of that.
Yeah, I think that's tremendously important. I will say that I've done a lot of work with regional food system organizations in various places across the country, and they also often overlook farmers markets. I don't think they have any concept of how productive farmers markets are for farmers. People will say, well, you can go to the farmers market and sell a couple $100s worth of produce. That's not going to be anything like selling through the food hub or selling to a restaurant or what have you. Well, at large farmers markets, at least, many of those farmers are selling thousands of dollars worth of produce on that Saturday. And then they're doing a couple other markets a week. So I don't know if it's because we're intense, but people have this concept that farmers markets are cute. In fact, I go to the International Public Market Conference every other year when they hold it. And for many years, and I've told them this at Project for Public Spaces, who runs that. And every year, they're very focused on regional public markets. So markets that are in buildings, Pike Place, and there's a Milwaukee Public Market, and Findlay and Cincinnati, and what have you. And so oftentimes I would run into people there that would say, oh, you're running a market in tents. Well, that's sweet. And it's like, yeah, and I'm generating $500,000 to our local community organization as a fundraiser. And that's just the part that we give back to them, guess how much the farmers and vendors are selling? And it's literally millions and millions of dollars per year. But there is no awareness of that in even many other parts of the food system, much less in the public's knowledge. So they don't understand what a powerful force farmers markets are. But regional food system organizations in general, where they're pulling together food hubs that are maybe aggregating produce and selling it to a school system or a prison system or some other institutional buyer, or they're sharing chefs that buy direct from farmers and helping to aggregate that through maybe high integrity distributors. And they're teaching farmers how to develop a CSA program and to market those CSA programs. And in California, we see a lot of this with the fishermen and the people organizing them to be able to sell direct to consumers, which was another thing that was prohibited for a long time, but is really strong now. So all of those working together is great. And actually, I think have considered in these early days another competitor in terms of online programs, online platforms where farmers can sign up with somebody and they'll get the produce from the farmer and they'll make the sale. They either have it picked up from the farmer or they have it delivered. And I think because a lot of those systems, when they start, call themselves an online farmers markets, which in our mind is an oxymoron. You can't be online and be a farmer's market because one of the definitions of a farmer's market is that you have the face-to-face interaction between farmer and eater. But those are also good additional income streams for the farmers. And it's not a terrible idea that farmers are in a farmer's market, but they also are doing an online platform and getting more of their food out there. And it's also a great idea for them to have a CSA. We have a number of farmers, both in Philly and in San Diego and all over the country, that have CSA boxes that are picked up at the farmer's market. So people can pick up their CSA box there and buy what's not in the box that week from another farmer and get their bread across the aisle from the baker. And I think that we should all be working together more. There is a tone that most of the online platforms take that when they're appealing to farmers and vendors, that you should do this because it's such a pain to do farmers markets. And that has very much been their tone. And Ready Farmer One is a whole book that was written by a farmer and sort of ghost written by one of the platform's founders that very much spends a good portion of the book telling people what a pain it is to do farmers markets and how it's too hard and you don't want to do that and you'll never make sales there. When instead, I think they should be saying, hey, your farmers market is going to give you this kind of return. You've got a much higher margin there because you're not paying distributors' costs or paying the platform to ship your stuff or to manage the sales. But you can also do these online. You're going to sell to a whole different group of customers that aren't going to make it out to the farmers market. And so you can have these two sources of income. One's the highest, one is possibly more steady because it's 7 days a week instead of one. But there has been a tone of that we're competing against each other. And I think we would all just be in so much better shape if we work together so that anybody actually putting together produce or any kind of product and getting it to consumers without a lot of layers of distributor costs and broker costs. I think we should consider each other an alliance as opposed to competitors. And I
Sure.
think we'll see that happen over time, but it's not quite there yet.
I mean, trashing a farmer's market because you have to set up a tent and load in and load
Yeah.
out and deal with customers who have questions and, all of those things can be seen as a pain in the butt, but they are also knitting us together.
And it's funny, farmers markets certainly are a lot of work, loading those trucks and popping those tents and just displaying on the tables. But we have especially really small farmers that come to the market. They're probably not making thousands of dollars, they're making hundreds of dollars on a Saturday or a Wednesday. But they come because they want that community. They want to meet other farmers, maybe older farmers that can give them tips. And there's a lot of that that happens at the market. They want to meet the consumers that are eating it. Farming can be a really lonely job, especially if you're on a small farm. And so having that day or two a week that they're out talking to people and talking to other farmers and talking to people that appreciate what they do and love the taste of their food is really important for them emotionally to keep them going. So farmers markets have many functions. One of them is getting fresh food to people, but one of them is the power of community that comes from a farmer's market in so many ways. And that's good for the farmers as well as the neighbors that are coming out to shop.
Let's talk about the consumer in that equation because I believe wholeheartedly that my life is better for knowing farmers
Yeah.
and understanding like who they are, what they do, what they're passionate about. Like, what are you seeing in terms of consumers really wanting those kinds of relationships?
They absolutely treasure it. We just had a talk on The Future's Analog, which is a book by David Sachs, and he was at our conference a few weeks ago. And I think just like way, way back, people of a certain age will remember this, the high-tech, high-touch backlash as things became digital and as we spent more time on computers. There was a huge craving for in-person interaction and in-person experiences. Same thing, more digital, more artificial intelligence. People are turning back to analog. So bookstores are thriving and stores that sell records, albums are thriving, even though you can pick anything up streaming. People are going to movie theaters again. And I think part of the reason that farmers markets are so strong right now and are continuing to grow and are thriving is the same thing. People are feeling really disconnected from in real life interaction. And you get that at the farmers market every week. You get to know your farmer personally. You get to talk to them about how to cook this item, or you get to discover some new food that you've never seen before by talking to the farmer. You get to the point where you don't require that organic label, and organic certification has been compromised in many ways, even more right now as the administration is changing things at the USDA. And so many farmers are not investing in the work and the cost of changing to certified organic. And that organic label is important in a big box grocery store because it tells you something about production. But you can get that information and more by talking to the person that's growing your food. So you can find out how they're producing it and what they're using for pest control and what kind of nutrients it's going to bring to your family when you buy that item. So I think analog life is really important. There was a big spike in farmers market activity during peak COVID protocols, even though farmers markets were very difficult to run then. Most of us had to use snow fencing and we had to count people in and count people out and to make sure there weren't too many people next to each other. And usually the only way to stay open was to be an essential service. So you would typically only have farms there, maybe a baker, but all the accessory items and even indulgent chocolate makers and things couldn't be there. But there also were empty shelves during that period, and there was a huge sense of isolation. And so going to the farmer's market to buy your groceries, we often saw consumers that were in tears when they were there in gratitude for the fact that they could still get fresh food and also that they could see their neighbor, albeit from a distance and possibly with a mask, but people they had not been able to talk to for weeks and months. And so making sure that the market stayed alive helped us keep communities together, helped us help especially seniors we saw maybe that lived alone and were super isolated, that helped them come together once a week. And I think that's something that's also happening now as some of the policies and tariffs and things are meaning it's leading to empty shelves in grocery stores and also very high prices. Farmers markets typically have not increased their prices over this because we're not shipping things in mostly. There's some inputs, some fertilizers and things that are a problem right now for farmers, but small farmers, not commodity farmers, but small farmers growing what, of course, as you and I know that, and many people don't know, specialty foods, which is fruits and vegetables. When they say farmers, they're not necessarily at an administrative level talking about specialty food farmers because that's what fruits and vegetables and things that people eat is classified as in governmental regs. Those prices have not really gone up at the farmers market because we're not dealing with the same kind of pressures as the grocery stores are. And so while there's still a perception, I think, in a lot of people's minds that it's more expensive to shop at the grocery store, I think in the last year or two, especially, that has really shifted. It was never entirely true. Depending on what you were buying, you could oftentimes get a better deal at the farmers market and your produce would last longer. And there were a lot of ways that it made it sensible. But right now, especially when prices are shooting up over fuel costs and things, I think you'll find that your farmers market pricing is what grocery store pricing was 2 years ago. And it's actually kind of a better deal now to shop at farmers markets. And our tables are full. We do not have empty shelves there.
There's a really human pattern underneath all of this. People don't usually change behavior because of values. They change when their experience stops matching the story they've been telling themselves. For a long time, the story has been, the system works. Food is abundant, accessible, taken care of somewhere in the background. But when that starts to crack, prices feel off, quality feels inconsistent, shelves aren't reliable, that creates a kind of low-grade cognitive dissonance. Something doesn't add up anymore. What farmers markets offer isn't just an alternative source of food. It resolves that dissonance. It gives people a version of the system that feels coherent again. You can see cause and effect. You can verify what you're buying. You can understand why something costs what it does. Psychologically, that's stabilizing. It reduces uncertainty in a very direct way. The idea that you have access to your farmers, it's a national security issue.
Really?
We saw that during COVID when there is a chink in the global supply chain, we turn to and panic to look for our local farmers.
Yeah, it's critically important to keeping people together, to keeping our food chains short so that we're not buffeted by global events quite so much. Another big challenge, though, too, and one where funding has been rescinded that is really difficult is climate change does exist. And we're seeing more and more farmers buffeted by that, by fires, by droughts, by extreme heat, by extreme cold. We're seeing a lot of crops suffer, and that's hard. Farming's hard.
Sometimes I hear criticism like, oh, farmers, they're all taking government subsidies and la 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 la. What people really need to understand is that the food that we eat, those specialty crops that are the things that we're putting in our salad and our saute and our meat and side dishes, dessert, things that we're using to cook delicious things in restaurants and in our homes are our specialty. They're not eligible for the most part for these kinds of subsidies. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, but also in terms of what's happening on the government front, like you had mentioned earlier, EBT and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which has been part of the Farm Bill for so long, and it has a reduction that will continue. What's the impact of that on farmers and farmers markets in general, and just your thoughts on what's happening?
Well, it's huge. So last fall, when they abruptly shut down SNAP and EBT, I would say a large percentage of farmers markets at this point not only accept EBT, we process it at the information booth, and then it's used at all the farmers, and then we reimburse them. But oftentimes we have worked to establish market match or double up bucks or extra incentive
How
programs
do
that
those work exactly?
so it depends. There's a big federal program, the Gus Snip, named after Gus Schumacher, who introduced it. Gus Snip program, you can establish those kind of matching programs, and it's typically some federal money and some state money. Well, the federal money has very much dwindled in the last year and a half. States are still stepping up to the extent that they can, but not always. So even in California, where we're strong on these kind of things, Governor Newsom took 30 million of 32 million a year out of that program in his budget 2 years ago. A huge campaign happened that was supported by farmers market managers, by farmers market participants, and by farmers market eaters that let the state legislature know that they wanted that back. And almost all of it came back. The budget comes out every 2 years. It's gone again in the initial proposed budget. So there's a strong, organized fight now to put it back in. But at most markets that use this, when you use your EBT SNAP card, most markets will match, say, the first $10 or the first $15. There's a market in North Carolina that is just phenomenal that gives you 60 extra dollars in nutrition incentives when you use your SNAP card for any amount. This is really important to stretching food dollars, but number one, a lot of people don't know about it. And number two, the government is trying to reduce the funds available to make that possible. So through a combination of working with private sponsorships and private foundations, and sometimes, as in North Carolina, getting the shoppers themselves to contribute a little bit to that fund when they shop at the market. And her shoppers have been very generous about that. We're still able to offer some extra money to people using SNAP and EBT. Those programs themselves, though, have recently been very restricted. So they've changed the age range that's eligible for it, and they've changed how many work days you have to qualify if you're unemployed. And they've really restricted the funds that go to veterans that used to have a waiver where they didn't necessarily have to be employed to get that money because a lot of times they weren't able either through PTSD or physical ailments. They've restricted a lot of those programs. And last year, for instance, when that was all cut very suddenly, a lot of the push was, oh, go to food banks and get that food. Well, food banks often use commodity food. I mean, a lot of it comes from subsidized things that the government has paid commodity farmers to grow that are then shoved into food banks. There's a lot of processed food in food banks. There's a lot of processed food makers that donate sugary cereals and that kind of thing to food banks. And so while a lot of people did go there and they had to rely on that, farmers markets as a whole worked really hard to make sure that we could keep offering some kind of incentives to people, even though they couldn't use their EBT cards because the accounts were empty, because it not only affects the people who are hungry, but it also affects the farmers. So when you're talking about, literally millions and millions of dollars coming through EBT into farmers markets every year, when that stops, it's not only the consumers that are suffering, but it's the farmers. That's a huge chunk of sales that are happening week after week all year long at farmers markets. And those were suddenly gone. And that really hurt farmers. And we developed a lot of kind of on the ground programs at individual markets to sort of subsidize farmers and find ways for them to keep making income when that stream was suddenly cut off. And it did come back, but it has come back in a more restricted way and continues to face changes. I was very surprised at one point in life to hear that people were really resentful of farmers and how much federal money was going to them. Our tax dollars are going to these wealthy, rich farmers, which was not my experience of farmers at all, because I was dealing with small farmers growing food for people. But there is a ton of money that goes to commodity farms, and that's the money that the government likes to trumpet about. And so people think that's going to all farms, but it absolutely is not. The small farmers and the farmers growing food for people, as opposed to soybeans, alfalfa, and corn that feed animals or make biofuel, completely different groups. And when you hear about farm subsidies, they're not going to the small farmers. And again, that creates it's a very unlevel playing field, because people making ultra processed foods out of corn, they can charge less for those ultra processed crackers and snacks and cereals because they're getting those subsidies than our farmers can charge for fruits and vegetables that are not subsidized. So it's a challenge, which is why, what you do, what American Farmland Trust does, what a lot of folks that are supporting small farmers do is so important, because they definitely are not being supported by the federal government, and less and less and less every day in our current times. So the grants that you give, obviously they can't replace all the money that at one time came from land grants and that kind of thing, but they go directly to farmers, and they're going directly to farmers that are feeding people, and they're accomplishing so much. So, for farmers is important for the kind of farmers that we deal with at farmers markets.
Thanks for listening to One Bite is Everything. Here, we connect the food on your plate to the bigger world of farmers markets, decision points, policies, trends, and we also give you opportunities to take action in a way that matters. I am your host, Dana DePrima, and what I keep coming back to after this conversation is how much of our food system is hidden in plain sight. Farmers markets feel familiar. They feel simple. But as you just heard, they are anything but. They are shaped by policy, by local interpretation of rules, by decisions about who gets to participate and how. They're balancing trust, economics, community, and access all in one place, once or twice a week for a few hours at a time. And most of us walk through them without realizing any of that. Here's the part that matters. Even without understanding the full system, your choices inside it still carry weight. Choosing to buy directly from a farmer doesn't just change what you eat. It changes how much that farmer earns, whether they can keep farming, and whether that land stays in production at all. That is not abstract. That's real. And it's real for you in your community too. Here's something simple to take with you. The next time you're at a farmer's market, don't just shop it. Notice it. Ask a question. Look a little closer. Pay attention to where things are coming from. And if you want to take it one step further, think about who you're supporting and how, because the more we understand how this works, the more intentional our choices can become. And that's where change actually starts. If this episode shifted how you think about something as everyday as a farmer's market, share it with someone who shops one, or might if they knew the real impact. That's how this spreads. And if you want to turn this awareness into action, you can learn more about the For Farmers movement, where these conversations become direct support for small farms at forfarmersmovement.com. Through the For Farmers movement, you can support high-impact farmer grants, nominate farmers in your community, and help direct real dollars with a single vote to where they matter most. That is how this podcast becomes something more. It becomes something you're a part of. Thanks for being here. I will see you here again next week for another episode of One Bite is Everything. I'm your host, Dana DePrima. Until then, eat like it matters, because it does.